Honor are about to Iran Vikramaratne, Economic Policy, the Government of India. To commence the proceeding
of driving exports. And then in 2016, we had that this year we should real execution and a tangible, realizable impact. So it is with that we have had this theme of execution, transformation, and realize. We have with us a galaxy of local and foreign personalities who have accepted our invitation to act as moderators and panelists, and we sincerely thank all of them. In particular, I would like to mention Sanjay Sanwal, who graciously agreed to stand in within the last 24 hours when Arvind Subramaniam had to unfortunately regret due to a local emergency, and Sanjay had graciously accepted our invitation to come in within the 24-hour notice. So Sanjay, thank you very much. And also an appreciation to our Governor, Indrajit Kumarasamy, who has graciously agreed to deliver the keynote address this morning. We have also another innovation in this year's sessions, where a dedicated digital channel under the theme Economy.lk has been formulated to live stream the sessions throughout the next 2 days, as well as selectively broadcast interviews with speakers and panelists. And we hope that this medium would be continued following the summit to be the tool of communication between the chamber and you in business as well as the government. So with those few words, let me again extend a warm welcome to all of you and enjoy the next 2 days of sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tyagaraja. I'd now like to invite the keynote speaker for the summit, Dr. Indrajit Kumarasamy, to deliver his address.
Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, other committee members of the CCC, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, honorable ministers, I should say as well. Let me start by thanking the CCC for inviting me to be with you this morning in this inaugural session. And before I proceed any further, I need to acknowledge the assistance I've got from two colleagues from the Central Bank, that is Vishuddhi Jayavikrama and Pongu Ratnavadivel, who helped me to put these remarks together. What I'm going to do is, I think the theme I was given was transforming the economy through changing business models, changing approaches to policy, and changing focus. So let me try and get through those three separate subheadings. But before I do that, I'd like to say a little bit about the backdrop, the landscape against which these transformations need to take place. Now, those of you who heard me speak before would have listened to me starting most of my speeches by saying that this is probably the most favorable set of circumstances that we've had for over 50, since the late 1950s, really. Why do I say that? Because from the 1950s, for about 25 years, Sri Lanka experienced dramatic and secular decline in its terms of trade. At the same time, there was a demographic surge. The surpluses were coming down, the number of people was increasing. So clearly, there were two major drags on the economy which compromised our development prospects in the 60s, 70s. Then at that time, we also had, for much of the period, inward-looking dirigist policies, which were clearly inappropriate for a small, open economy. So the drags from the terms of trade effects and the demographic pressure was compounded by a set of inappropriate policies. Then there was a liberalization in 1977, but shortly after that, we had the 30-year conflict. Now we don't have any such major drags on our economy, and we are in Asia, the most dynamic region in the world, which is why I say that this is the best set of circumstances we've had for over 50 years. Now, in order to take advantage of those circumstances, there are, in my view, three paradigm shifts that we need to internalize into our mindset and to respond to them if we are to take advantage of these favorable circumstances. So let me go through those three paradigm shifts, if I may, one by one. Ranking on per capita income and our ranking on the Human Development Index, Sri Lanka has the second largest gap. So that has been our strength. We've been very good in terms of social development, but not as good in terms of growth and wealth creation. Now there are those who say, well, look, we have our own ways of doing things. We've done very well in terms of social indicators. Why are you economists so exercised about growth? Well, the answer to that is, again, a socio-political one. While we've had these very good social indicators, it is also a fact that we've had two youth insurrections in the south and a separatist conflict in the north, where tens of thousands of our young people have died. And while there's complex causality explaining those episodes, for me, the most significant causal factor is the mismatch between expectations and opportunities. We haven't created enough opportunities for gainful employment for our young people. And that has been part of the problem because the economy has not grown. We haven't invested enough, we haven't grown enough, we haven't created enough wealth to satisfy the expectations of successive generations of young Sri Lankans. And we now have an aspirational society who have significant expectations in terms of material advancement. So unless we can balance social development with growth and wealth creation, it is clearly going to be a problem. So that's something that we need to do. Second, the second paradigm shift is the graduation, Sri Lanka's graduation from low-income country status to lower middle-income country status. For many years, before really 2008, 2009, we were a low-income country. Not only were we a low-income country, but we were very much a donor darling because we were the second country after Chile to liberalize among the countries which had pursued a dirigist route. So the traditional donors were very keen to show good development outcomes in a country which had liberal economic policies and a liberal polity, an open polity, a democratic polity. So we got lots of money, which actually spoiled us. We learned to live beyond our means, and every so often when the situation got out of hand, we would get bailed out on concessional money on the back of an IMF program. I think we have about 15 or 16 IMF programs that we've had. I don't know whether there is a country which has had more IMF programs than ours. But now that we've graduated to low middle income country status, we no longer have access to concessional money in terms of analyze. One of the reasons, or one of the now what that macroeconomic policy making, and also on macroeconomic policy making, as you are well aware, probably more aware than anybody else in terms of being the business community, in the government budgetary operations, the budget deficit, which has pumped excess demand into the system. Our growth rate tends to be more strongly correlated to the size of the budget deficit. If you look at the successful countries in East and Southeast Asia, their growth is correlated to the size of the current account surplus in their balance of payments. It's exports driven. Ours is artificially created, a sugar highs, a boom created by unsustainable budget deficits. We simply cannot keep repeating that cycle. We need to have fiscal consolidation. So it's encouraging that the government has embarked upon a program of fiscal consolidation, which is primarily, but not exclusively, revenue enhancement driven. So the government's major medium-term fiscal objectives are to contain the fiscal deficit, web-based tax filings for income taxes, VAT, etc. Now, while revenue enhancement is a key objective for the government, there are also plans for more disciplined spending control and appropriate prioritization of public investment. In fact, the overall public expenditure at around 19–20% of GDP, if you look at comparator countries, is pretty okay. Problem is the quality of our public expenditure, the quality and composition of our public expenditure, which is what we need to focus upon in terms of getting a higher return for the government. And in terms of SOEs, it's very encouraging that we've had these statements of intent from the 5 largest state-owned enterprises financing needs at the lowest possible cost in terms of mobilizing resources. 2019, 2020, 21. It's challenging, but it's manageable, but we can't let it get worse. Now, let me, having talked about fiscal policy, now move on to monetary policy. As you've probably heard, trying to do is to have a much more forward-looking, proactive monetary policy. Historically, if you've seen, we've tended to be behind the curve. The economy has overheated, and then monetary policy has been tightened. Now, there is a transmission period of at least 12 months between the time interest rates are increased and they begin to have a full impact on the real economy. So we should set interest rates today for what we think is going to be happening in about a year's time. So that is what we're trying to do now by having a much more proactive policy. We want to be able to set interest rates so that when you do this in a proactive way, what you do avoid is the volatility in interest rates. In the past, we had high peaks, and then it comes down, then a high peak and comes down, and becomes very difficult for business. So what we're trying to do is to smooth the interest rate trajectory by moving quickly and proactively so that if there's any sign of inflationary pressure in the economy, we will move. In fact, in the March increase, at that time, we really didn't see any excess demand in the system. But the tax changes as well as supply disruption due to the drought meant that headline inflation was high. And we thought once headline inflation got up to over 7%, that would begin to influence inflation expectations, that wages, etc. There would be a second round effects which created demand side pressure, which is why we increased the rate in March to nip the problem in the bud. And that is the way we want to operate going into the future, to move quickly and proactively to ensure that we have low and stable inflation going forward. On the exchange rate, those of you who follow the FX market will probably now realize that the central bank is not intervening in any way. We don't even set the reference rate. And the rate has so far been reasonably stable. And one thing we really need to do is to get away from the past practice of having an overvalued exchange rate. If we are serious about export transformation, and as I will say later, export transformation is absolutely crucial for us to address our debt problem, for us to achieve 6, 7, 8 maybe % growth going forward. And if you have an overvalued exchange rate, you will not achieve that. And the other thing is, you cannot sustain an overvalued exchange rate. Historically, in the past, what we've done is we've tried to defend an overvalued exchange rate, used large amounts of our reserves, depleted our reserves to defend the rupee. Often those reserves were borrowed reserves, and then you end up having the double whammy of A, external reserve depletion, and B, a sudden and sharp depreciation of the currency when things are when it's no longer possible to keep defending the rupee because reserves have depleted so much. So we've done that a few times. We do not want to do that again. We do not want to use our borrowed reserves, which are largely borrowed reserves, to defend the indefensible. And the idea is really to set the rate in such a way that it's market-oriented. Clearly, we will not allow any sharp fluctuations in the rupee. We will gradually let the rupee depreciate to the point where the real effective exchange rate is 100, and then manage the nominal interest exchange rate to maintain the going to be set, so that you will have this predictable set of frameworks within which you can assess how interest rates, exchange rates, etc. are going to develop as we go forward. Now, one of the next sub-theme is changing focus. And under the first one was changing policy. Second one was, under changing policy, I'd also like to, as I said, I'd like to talk about trade policy and in the investment climate. Let me start with the investment climate. As you know, the government has set up a series of task forces on 8 of the pillars of the World Bank's Doing Business Index, and they're working through ways and means of deregulating, reducing the number of steps, introducing technology where it can facilitate processes. So that process is going on, not as quickly as we would like, but that process is underway. And I think revamping of investment promotion framed under. Then, if I can quickly speak about trade facilitation, I think you would have seen even in the press today, the customs process is being improved through technology. The single electronic window is now, I think, almost ready, and there are other processes within the customs department which are being computerized, and the transaction costs of cross-border movement of goods of goods through the customs department should come down significantly going forward. Now, the big area in terms of government policy, in terms of changing focus in government policy, is clearly trade policy. And here there are different elements. One, the government has now put out a trade policy framework. It's just a 20-page document. In my view, it's very coherently and well written, and it sets out for the first time what the government's trade policy is going to be. I would urge you to read it because it gives you a good framework in terms of where the government wants to go. The government is also has introduced an anti-dumping bill into Parliament. Clearly, if one is going to negotiate trade agreements, you have to give the domestic producer protection through an anti-dumping bill, and that is well underway in terms of legislation. Also, the government is putting in place a trade adjustment package. What that means is the government is working with the World Bank, the ITC in Geneva, with European EU funding to create a program whereby domestic industries which could be affected by liberalization of the economy through the trade agreements, where these enterprises could be helped to become more competitive. So that's one element of the trade adjustment package. The second element is to help workers who might be affected to be retrained to acquire new skills. So that's the trade adjustment package that is being worked upon. So you have the trade policy framework, you have the anti-dumping bill, and you have the trade adjustment package. These are all complementary to what is really the jewel in the crown, in my view, which are the 3 trade agreements that are being negotiated. As you know, the government is trying to deepen and widen the agreement with India to go from just an agreement in goods to include services, investment, training, and technology. A similar agreement is being negotiated with China and with Singapore. Now, there is naturally a great deal of concern when a relatively small country like Sri Lanka negotiates with much larger countries like India and China. And there's great asymmetry in their economies. But there are tried and tested ways of addressing this. First, the large country accepts the principle. All those are structured in such a way having to do much less than the larger country. So that is how these are negotiated. Our negotiators are well aware of these mechanisms. Of course, one has to negotiate rigorously to make sure that our interests are protected, but there is a way of coming to these agreements while protecting our interests. Now, why is this, in my view, such an important thing? One is, there is no country in the world. You know, there are 190 countries which are all looking for investment, which are all looking to boost their trade. Now, there is no country in the world, to the best of my knowledge, which has got preferential access to China, India, and Europe. See, with the restoration of GSP+, we now have preferential access to Europe as well. That's, if you count that up, and we have also a bilateral trade agreement in goods with Pakistan. If you count all that up, that's a market of 3 billion people. I do not know of any other country which has such access in terms of preferential access. So this clearly will create more opportunities for our exporters to have preferential access to such a large market. But more than that, what it enables us to do is to leverage this access to a market of 3 billion people to attract investment into this country. So people can locate here and sell to China, sell to India, sell to Europe on a preferential basis. Now, with 109 is potentially the USP that Sri Lanka would have in terms of having this market access, to me, is significant and material. And we need to be able to use that effectively. So let me now move from policy, if I may, to changing focus. And here the focus is changing in terms of the growth model. As you know, in the period immediately after the conflict, growth was driven by foreign commercial borrowing financed public investment in infrastructure. Now, the fiscal deficit and public debt profile is such that that model has run out of headroom. It just is not possible anymore. So it has to be a private sector-led process. It's not ideological, it's purely pragmatic. There is no choice. I mean, countries have been successful using various mixes of the public and private sector. China and Vietnam on one side, more market-oriented countries on the other. For us, there's no choice. The government just does not have the fiscal space to lead the development process, so it has to be the private sector. And you know, if you look at, and this is, if some data from the World Bank shows the role of the private sector in development. The private sector generates 90% of the jobs, funds over 60% of investment in developing countries, contributes more than 80% of government revenue in low and middle income countries. It caters to ever-increasing demand for essential services such as banking, telecommunications, health, and education. It invests, designs, and produces a myriad of goods and services which the poor use and those that drive the economy. And it is the dominant producer of exports in almost every economy. So that is what the private sector does. And really our private sector, in my view, needs to play a much bigger role in all these areas. Now, as a result of everything that the private sector does in developing countries, it has a substantial influence on the way in which economies are shaped and developed. This influence spans across issues such as the type of goods and services that the economy produces, the means by which this production occurs, and even the soft and hard infrastructure that is built to facilitate this production. It is also well established that higher private investment is associated with faster growing economies. Now, let me quickly turn, if I may, to some of the government's major development programs, which are going to support what I have been telling you. If you look at the two corridors that the Prime Minister has been talking about, if you look at the Central Highway, we start with Kandy. Japan is developing a master plan for Kandy. There will be a strong cultural tourism component, but also a economic zone, an industrial zone. Then as you come down the Central Highway, Kurunagala and Kuliapitiya, there is interest for economic zones in that area. Already, if I'm not mistaken, there's some interest from Indian parties and Korean parties. Then you keep coming down to Colombo, you have the Western Region Megapolis project. Because straight after the port deal, the Chinese are willing to do investments in what they call foundational industries. That is cement, LNG plant for energy, steel billets, ship repair. That comes in the first phase. Then they're willing to take on, they've said 15,000 acres of land for industrial zones. Even if we do a third of that, it'll transform those areas. And we have done very little for those people. It has been, in a way, those were the heartlands of the JVP insurrections. There was a reason why they were the heartlands for the JVP insurrections in 71 and 88, 89. He has an opportunity to transform it, transform those areas. We need to look at it like that, not just as a port deal. Then if you go further up, Trincomalee, the Indians, the Singaporeans and Japanese are going to work together to produce a master plan for that area. And there, development of Trincomalee can also, not in addition to developing the east, can also provide opportunities for people from the Rajarata. It can transform opportunities there. So these economic corridors really have the potential to transform the economy. And I think for the north, there's going to be 200% investment allowance given for investment in the north. So there is this regional balance in terms of the government's development strategy. But of course, we need to implement all these things. Execution is the challenge, but the plans are good. Let me finally take just literally 2-3 minutes to rush through. One of the things was the change in business model. And here, what I'd like to say is that, you know, there has been a perception that manufacturing is not really for Sri Lanka. That it's services, that our wages are now too high, that we can't really compete in manufacturing. For me, that is an interpretation which actually would lock out a lot of opportunity. Clearly, we can't focus on low labor cost manufacturing. That is out. But still, through investment, through increasing total factor productivity, we can become competitive in other areas of manufacturing. Why do I say that? Because, you know, to leverage the excellent relationship will be negotiated within the next, say, 12 months at all 4 levels. Of those, the most, but we have to have a vision at how we are going to use our land, what are the crops. I would ask all of you to ask yourself the question, not to look at all the negative. There are plenty of negative things. But I would ask you to ask these questions. One, are the macroeconomic fundamentals improving? Is macroeconomic policy making taking place in a more sensible and stable way? Is the investment climate improving? Slowly maybe, but is it improving? Is it going in the right direction? Are transaction costs coming down in terms of cross-border movements of goods and services? These are the kind of questions. Are we going in the right direction? If we are going in the right direction, I would urge you to put your money here rather than in Bangladesh or in Fiji or in Ethiopia. That is something I've just asked these rational questions. Are we going in the right direction? If we are, this is the time to get in as far as the Sri Lankan story is concerned. I must say it upsets me a little bit that I see foreigners investing in our stock market. I see foreigners now beginning to invest in our government securities. We floated an international sovereign bond. It was almost 7 times oversubscribed. Yet, the domestic private sector still got its wallets tightly buttoned up. It's not something I understand very well. It is noisy, that is untidy.
I'd now like to invite Honorable Eran Wickramaratne, State Minister of Finance, to address the
development. And whether you feel you want to have a
immediately, it's stability and consistency. Every time I meet the private sector, I hear the word consistency. So we've taken it on board. Stability and consistency. We need structural reform and we need an investor-friendly environment. This is the direction in which we must go. When I see the word transform, transformation and all this, I get a little worried. I get a little worried because I often wonder what actually does it mean. Transformation means a lot of hard work. You know, we need data, for example, and data is very difficult to get. If you can get hold of the data, you're going to spend a lot for the data. And we need to rethink this. We need research. We need research institutions. Our decisions have to be based basically on really fact. You see, we have agriculture, which is 10% of the GDP, 28% of the labor force. And if you ask questions about the use of land, the land usage, you're not going to get all the information you actually require. We have a meteorological department which tells us about the flood after the flood has come. And I'm saying these things really not to put anyone down, but the point I'm trying to make is that we have to be more scientifically based. We need the information, we need the research. Transformation is not what worked for me or my company working for the country. Transformation is a lot more than that. It's about really having the data, really having the knowledge, having the skills and the ability to actually deliver, getting rid of the information deficit. In Colombo, we have lots of opinions. We have lots of silver bullets. And I'm looking beyond the silver bullets. That's why I'm saying, how do we actually fix the problems that we are facing? Dr. Kumaraswamy went through the economy very quickly, and at the risk of repeating very quickly some things, clearly the message is that things are getting into place. GDP growth rates are 2015 4.8, 2016 4.4. This year we thought we'll get to 5, but we have to contend with the drought and the floods. So there are issues. The global situation, economic recovery is still not very firm. You heard about monetary policy, fiscal policy. We have the benefit of the lifting of the fishing ban, the benefit of GSP coming in, and yet to see what it really translates for. Inflation is targeted, and inflation is going in the right direction. I think by the end of 2018, we'll probably have it at much better levels than we have it presently. The current account deficit has come down from in 2016 from 2.4, and it's coming down further. Gross official reserves in April, when we were talking in forums like this, was $5 billion. It's $7 billion. as of today, $7 billion. Sovereign bond was done, syndicated loans have been done. The exchange rate, many criticized us when we moved to a flexible exchange rate. Every adjustment has its cost, but I think making the right decision and sticking with the right decision is critically important. FDIs below par. You know what we got last year, but we are a lot more optimistic. There was reference to the Hambantota port deal. Even as we talk, decisions are being made. We are going to sign the Hambantota port deal. We are going to go with it. We have negotiated, and we have negotiated hard. We are going to basically reap maybe $1.1 billion, maybe $400 billion of that just in this year. Fiscal outcomes, revenue has gone up from 12 to 13.3 to 14.2. The budget deficit has come down from 7.6 in 2015 to 5.4, and probably a little under that in 2017, going to the long-term target of getting it down to 3.5, with the governor of the central bank mentioned as if he thinks as the key factor for macroeconomic instability, bringing it under control. The extended fund facility with the IMF, we've just concluded the second review successfully. And sometimes people throw it out and say, why do you actually need this? We need it because it brings in a certain level of discipline into the economy. It helps the country to maintain its country rating. It helps our banks to maintain and steady their ratings, which in turn has an overall impact. So we are going in the right direction. I won't refer to the FTAs because much was said about the FTAs. And one thing you can be sure is, it doesn't matter who's on the street, this government will continue for its full term till at least February 2020, when it will be completing 4.5 years. It's not that we cannot deal with issues on the street. We are trying to deal with issues on the street in keeping with the mandate that we have received. That's really the struggle. That's really the issue in this period in which we are, this interim period in which the country is transforming its economy. I would like to very briefly conclude by saying about a few things that we are doing immediately. As we talk this week, we are bringing into Parliament the Foreign Exchange Bill. We are doing away with the decade-old Exchange Control Act. It's a conceptual move away from exchange control to exchange management. It's a conceptual move away from the government thinking that it's the owner of the hard-earned foreign exchange of its exporters, to the exporters being the owner and not the government. That's the conceptual change in this. There was a criminalization of exchange control violations in the previous act. We have removed that criminalization. There were prison sentences that were possible in the old act. We are moving away from outward control for incentives for exchange being brought into the countries. Those who have pending cases and violations could regularize by remitting and basically paying a penalty fee. If they remit it into government securities, even that fee will not be applicable. So there is no need for the exchange controller or the minister to approve. We are moving towards more a rule-based regulatory system. And that would be this week in Parliament, and we will have that exchange control bill passed in Parliament this week. We have also, as you know, presented an Inland Revenue Act in Parliament. It's a new act. It's a new act. It's an act which takes away discretion from the minister, and it's also going more to a rule-based system. You don't have to queue up outside the Ministry of Finance trying to get your exemptions. We are moving away from that kind of economic management. We are moving to a system which will say, this is the income tax, this is the tax table, this is what you actually pay. For corporate taxes, two regimes. One a concessionary regime, and the other one the normal regime. There will be no exemptions in the new system. There will be some favored industries, and that's going to cause some controversy, but that is why there are two if you want, rates that are going to be applicable there. This act has been drawn largely by the Sri Lankan bureaucracy, and obviously people have issues with it. Politically speaking, the government has an overall objective. Dr. Kumaraswamy talked about level growth across the country, not just a favored western province, but far more level growth. I do not agree with the investments in Hambantota. I think they were big mistakes, and we should not forget it. But the real question is, what do you make out of a mistake that has already been made? I'll give you a simple example. I went to the Hambantota airport when I was a member of the opposition to look at that airport. Our policy formulators and our politicians should have actually asked the question 10 years ago, did we actually need that airport, or did we actually need a second runway at the international airport in Colombo? Those were the kinds of questions that were not addressed. But the question now is, as an economist, once those investments have been made, we need to make sure that we are able to get the maximum out of those buried investments. And therefore, we are moving on Hambantota. We will have that deal signed very quickly. So there are issues on the Inland Revenue Act for sure. Many chambers, many industry groups have come and seen us. There are many challenges in the courts. We welcome those challenges, because what we are doing, we want to do it upfront, we want to do it transparently. And when we adopt the amendments in Parliament, we will certainly take into account the directions of the court. Not only that, the suggestions that have been brought up from many interested parties, all the reasonable suggestions will be included when we move the amendments. Some of the issues that came up were the protection of taxpayer rights. It was on depreciation, on capital allowances, as was mentioned. Then the applicable date of the law, and also implementation. We certainly have in mind to have a smooth implementation. Some of the things that are coming in the future are the audit bill, the customs ordinance, are some of the things that we are looking to come up in the future, and maybe over the next 6 months, so that we get the legislative framework broadly in place as we go into our next budget. On the infrastructure side, you know that we connected last week all the banks to customs. The Parliamentary Accounts Committee, PAC, appointed an all-party committee, which I was chair of. And the point of the committee was to look at how the leakage in government revenue could be minimized. 3 institutions in government bring 85% of government's revenue: customs, inland revenue, and the excise department. The other 300 institutions bring only 15% of the revenue. And there's an all-party consensus, and a report has been published, that by using information technology, we can reduce the leakage. Let's face it, business is corrupt. That is why government is corrupt. And one way of dealing with systemic corruption is to use information technology to reduce the discretion given to politicians and given to high state officials. That is the way forward for this country. And therefore, I want to pay tribute to the customs and to the central bank and to LANKA Clear and the bankers and all those who are involved in a very short time in actually putting all the banks online in terms of customs payments. Lot more to be done in terms of social transfers, digitalization of the economy, and I think I'm hoping that Dr. Harsha will probably touch on some of these issues. If I were to close, if there's one more very important thing that we need to do very quickly, that is to do in the procurement space. We need to have e-procurement. We need, like the countries in the region, even countries like Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Afghanistan have gone ahead of Sri Lanka on e-procurement, drastically reducing the number of days. In Bangladesh, they reduced it to 29 days from 51. In India, from 90 to 135 days to 35 days. In Korea, end-to-end, 2 hours, procurement can be completed. And the cases are very compelling. This is what we need to do. We have a National Procurement Commission. Therefore, they can give policy direction. We do not need new legislation, but we need an agency for its operation. We need to invest in it. We need to go for government electronic procurement. All ministries must publish tender notices. They must provide the information. Bids need to be received in that way, and awards made. We know that even today, the situation is unsatisfactory. A professor writing in the newspaper said that the cost of building a kilometer of highway had gone up by 50% in the last 3 years. This is unacceptable. We need to bring these costs down. So one thing that we will focus on over the next few months is actually in delivering and getting everybody around the table to cooperate so that we have an electronic procurement system. Thank you again for inviting me to share these few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wickramaratne. May I now invite Honorable Dr. Harsha De Silva, Deputy Minister of Economic Policy, to address the gathering.
Tia, Sanjeev, Indrajit, Eran, friends, policy reorientation for economic transformation is the topic given to me to sort of take 10 minutes or so. How do I get this on? And I'm just going to reiterate some things that you already know. Indrajit talked about how our system works. He ended really well. We got that's what we have. So we're going to, try and improve what we have, but we are not going to get anything totally different to what we currently experience. Iran was really very straightforward and sort of to the point. Say, we are going to do this. We will do this. Talked about a lot of operational stuff. What I'm going to do is to try and set up sort of a more longer term, broader policy sort of reorientation work that we are doing. So Sri Lanka's growth has been reasonably strong. We all know that. Human Development Index is high, and people live long, and lots of infrastructure projects. Even during the war, we grew. So then what is the issue? Look at the numbers after 2010. Racing up. But if you really look at it, we're stuck around 4% on per capita GDP growth. You see those 3 dots after the war? 6, 7, 8, 9%. Up to 2012. What happens in 2013? Drops to 3.5% from 9%. These are not doctored numbers, these are real numbers. So how did it fall from 9% to 3%? So where's the sustainability of our growth? How do you keep growing at 8%, 9%? Where is the peace dividend? They all said after the war, we will add 2% to growth. Where is that 2%? Then what's the issue? It's very simple. We messed up our export equation. And unless we fix it, we are not going to go anywhere. We talked about our issues that we face on a daily basis. True. But we got to move beyond the daily basis. Let Iran and the finance ministry worry about collecting the taxes. getting the excise department to make sure that the alcohol taxes are paid, income taxes are paid and all that. But our unit is going to look beyond that. Reorient the policy. So look at these numbers. You're all smart people sitting here. Sri Lanka, 90 to 94, almost 2.25% of that growth came from exports, whatever that growth was at that time, and kept falling. 2006 to 2010, 0.5%, 10 to 14, 1.5%, and the whole period 1.07%. And compare that with the other countries that we are competing. All these numbers are courtesy Center for International Development at Harvard University and others for working with us very closely. And this is what I think Eran was also alluding to earlier. We got to look at the data. We can't just make decisions based on some Satrakarya told us to do it. We have to analyze the data, figure out what's right, what's wrong, and do it. So, our export shares fell dramatically. Look at the one on your left. Export of goods and services in 1990. Singapore, Malaysia, Sri Lanka. We are 30%. Look at the middle one, 2000. Okay, we are still holding on. Thailand beat us, Philippines, Vietnam. But look at what happened when we came to office in 2015. At the end of 2014, we're the last. I'm not talking about Sirima Bandaranaka time in 1960. I'm talking about 2010 to 2014. 2000 to 2014. When we were all actually sitting here, how many times have we had it here, this conference? 12 times? So every year, somebody made this point. You, the business people, us, the opposition, then the government, certainly should have listened to the flags being raised. So then how did this happen? And unless we reorient our economy from a non-tradable to a tradable economy, forget it, we will not make it. We have only 20 million people. How much can we sell to 20 million people? What is our hinterland? Our hinterland is not Hambantota. Our hinterland is Kerala, Karnataka, Telangana, Tamil Nadu. Sanjeev won't mind, but that is the truth. 450 million people, $450 billion in the southern 5 states of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the rest of the Indian Ocean. I mean, think about it. Whether it is Parakrama Bahu's time or the British India Company. You know, Sri Lanka to me is not a South Asian country. Sri Lanka to me is an Indian Ocean country. And unless we are able to leverage that God-given advantage, we will meander along, and perhaps in another 50 years' time, maybe we can become a middle income country. These are issues that the data very clearly shows that we have remained an old country. What do we produce? What do we sell? Look at that. 3/4 of our exports are of low complexity products, implying low know-how. Thank God for some of the innovations that had happened in the apparels. Thank God for the IT guys who start now exporting products. Those guys sitting at Trade City and other places, not just doing outsourcing work, but creating product. But yet, we are 3/4 old products. The problem with this is that many other countries can compete with us in these old products. Unless we add technology and improve the complexity of our products, we cannot be competitive in the global marketplace. So we have to reorient from what we are to what we have to become. This shows the diversification of our exports. Not only that we have very little that we export, but we have been exporting, like I said, the same things for decades, as opposed to, say, Thailand. Look at how they diversified in the last so many years, from just being in low-cost agricultural and low-cost apparels. They've diversified. They've added technology. I mean, I'm just taking one example. So what I want to say is that we understand the problem. We're not going to run away from the fact that we have an enormous challenge that we need to overcome. See, when the economy grew after the war to 9%, how did it grow? Where did the growth come from? Right? I mean, you must understand that. And if the growth was coming from sustainable sectors, then it would not have dropped to 3%. So how sustainable is debt-fueled infrastructure-led growth? How many Hambantota ports can we put with borrowed money? How many Mattal airports can we put with borrowed money? How many $1 million per kilometer roads can we put with borrowed money? How much of real estate can we put with borrowed money? It hits a limit. And Indrajit has been talking about bunching of our repayments in 19, 20, 21, and 22. We have to pay this year, what, 4.5 trillion rupees in debt? No, trillion. Right? So, we must be able to generate income. The problem with generating GDP in rupees is that our treasury won't have the dollars to repay the debt we have denominated in dollars. So the quality of the growth is important, not just the quantity of growth. If the growth is coming from dollar-denominated revenue, then we can borrow in dollars. Then we can import in dollars. You try to see what I'm trying to say. But if the growth is coming from rupee-denominated income, then we are going to run into problems. So as business people, you realize in a very simple sort of analysis what the problem is. Right? So what appears to be the constraints, right? Trade component of growth, right? So this is what I'm saying. Trade component of growth is a constraint. So when we are talking about tradables, it does not mean we are only talking about exports. Exports is a large component of tradables, but tradables is any product that you can manufacture competitively. So if somebody can manufacture here competitively and sell to the domestic industry, domestic market, that is a tradable. That's okay. What is not okay is to put an 800 rupee tax on a pair of something and then to say, look, we have to ensure that local producer is taken care of forever and ever and ever. That is not okay. We have to become competitive. And that kind of tradable manufacturing is acceptable. But you cannot be non-competitive and compete in the global marketplace. You ask any one of big exporters who are sitting here, can you, Sharad, export something that is non-competitive to the US market and charge what you charge? You can't. Right? So it has to be fixed. Agriculture, fisheries, low productivity, Iran talked about, new export products, right? So the issue that we see on the ground is we say, where is FDI? So why should FDI come? And what is FDI for if we are unable to produce the kinds of things that can be sold in the global marketplace competitively? So what we need to fix in terms of policy, most binding constraints is on from the point of view of the government, coordination failure. I mean, Harvard University study has very clearly and ruthlessly showed that this is a massive problem. Coordination. The number of ministries, the policies that are made by one ministry is contradictory to the policies of another ministry. There are 4 different ministries that look into agriculture, or 5. Transport, megapolis, transport, this, that, other thing. How does the private sector coordinate with the government? Right? And there are issues of access to land, policy uncertainty, particularly in terms of taxes and trade. And I hope that these we would certainly be able to address urgently from the point of view of policy. So what you can expect in the next, perhaps in the month or so, is a revised 3-year policy plan to be released at the 2nd anniversary that will show you precisely what we are going to do till the end of the first term of this government, and hopefully an 8-year plan till 2025. But having understood that we as a government will have to address the fundamental policy problem of reorienting this country's economy from a non-tradable, unsustainable, inefficient one to a tradable, sustainable, efficient one. And that is what I and another 17 people have been tasked by the Prime Minister to try and do. So we have been taking advice from many who have been studying our economy, and we will be able to show you in the next month or so what our plan is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to invite our guest of honor for today, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, to deliver his address.
His Excellency Governor Indrajit Kumar Swamy, His Excellency Minister Vikramaratne, His Excellency Deputy Minister De Silva, our host, Chairman Thiagaraja, and his team at CCC for graciously organizing this event, friends, ladies and gentlemen. As Minister Vikramaratne alluded a few minutes ago, there is a need for changing the conceptual framework with which our economies need to be managed and reformed. There is also a need to think very seriously about policy making based on real-time feedback and data. And I'm going to take these two issues up and hopefully try and give you some sort of flavor of how we are both changing our conceptual frameworks in India and how we intend to reform our economies going forward. Now, like many economies, developing countries of the late 20th century, India, for the first 4.5 decades after it became independent, used a very socialist import substitution framework of policy making. And to put it politely, the approach proved to be a disaster. And ultimately, in 1991, the economy faced a very serious crisis and forced India's economy to begin liberalizing. Now, although the economy was opened up and the old socialist policies were stripped away gradually, the conceptual frameworks that had underpinned that way of thinking were not entirely replaced. And one of those meta concepts which underlay many of that period's thinkings was of thinking of the economy as a gigantic machine. Now, why does this matter? It matters because, you see, it affects the way we think about how we manage the economy and reform it. Now, when you build a machine, how do you go about it? What you do basically is to very meticulously create a design, a plan, and then try and implement that plan as meticulously as possible. Now, the problem is that in reality, an economy is not a machine. It's in fact an evolving ecosystem, an ecosystem that is continuously buffeted by all kinds of shocks. It can be technological shocks, international developments, political shocks, and so on. And this causes real difficulty in running an economy and trying to reform it by thinking of it like a machine. Now, let me explain this through an analogy. Now, many of you have dogs, and I'm sure you take your dogs out to the park and throw a frisbee and get it to catch the frisbee. Now, most people will just throw the frisbee and their dog will catch a frisbee. But you see, economists will go about it very, very differently. So an economist will first go to the park. He will measure the speed of the wind. He will look at the design of the frisbee. He will do research into the breed of the dog. He will look at his muscles and look at how muscular and strong he is and feed this all into a computable general equilibrium model. Then after running that model for several iterations, he will come up with a forecast. And then, if he's a policymaker, he will then provide this forecast to the Frisbee Policy Committee, who will then give us forward guidance. Now, based on the forward guidance, the economist will take his dog and tie him up to the post at the point at which the frisbee is supposed to land, and then he'll go back to position and throw the frisbee. Now, as you all know, that like the world around it, the park is a complex system. There can be a gust of breeze, There can be a slight difference in the way you throw the frisbee. There may be a scratch on the frisbee. Any of these small differences will cause the frisbee to land significantly different, at a significantly different point from where the forecast was. And of course, the dog will not manage to catch the frisbee. And the economists will be entirely surprised by this, and they will form a committee who will submit a report on why the dog failed to catch the frisbee. Now, meanwhile, all other normal people are throwing their frisbees, and their dogs are catching the frisbee. Now, how do these non-economist dogs manage to catch the frisbee? The way they do it is that all that they do is the dog watches generally in the direction in which the frisbee is being thrown, and then watches the frisbee very, very carefully, and then flexibly runs around it and adjusts its body, keeps watching the frisbee until finally it grabs the frisbee with its mouth. Now, what this system of catching a frisbee is basically the following: a general framework, and then a feedback loop of information, i.e. data, that is continuously used in order to understand how this frisbee is floating and then catching it. Now, how does all of this matter for policy making? Now, in order to understand this, I'm going to first go to an area outside of economic policy to something that is also quite dear to me, which is urban design, to make you understand how policy making would work. Now, whenever you have South Asians asked, how should we plan our cities, which is the best planned city in the world, they will almost always say Singapore. Now, the problem is Singapore is not at all planned in the way we think it is. So if you have to go back to the 1950s and think of all the great cities that in the world that were planned in the 1950s. But in the 1950s, the idea was that, like economies, cities were machines of living. In fact, this particular quote I'm using is from a gentleman called Le Corbusier, who was very, very popular with urban designers of the 1950s. And he, in fact, went ahead and, in fact, designed a city called Chandigarh in India, which Indians are very, very proud of. And at about the same time, other cities around the world were also built: Milton Keynes outside of London, Brasilia, Canberra, and so on. Now, at about the same time, in the mid-60s, Singapore became free. Now, when Singapore became free, it was actually a slum-ridden, poor city. It had been a British naval outpost. It was continuously racked by communal riots. And now that the British were leaving, there were genuine concerns about what the future of this resource-poor, crowded little island was going to be. In fact, the Malaysians were so concerned about its economic future that they actually threw Singapore out of the Federation. So there was Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew with an island with no future. And what he began to do is that he decided to try and build it up using the port facilities that had been left behind by the British to convert Singapore into a light manufacturing and a container shipping terminal. And that policy was so successful that by the 70s, Singapore had become one of the world's largest ports and a major hub for garments, ready-made garments, and other such sectors. And about that same time, they then began to add in a new sector, which was oil refining. And that too succeeded very well. But the problem was that as it succeeded, its wages began to rise, and already by the 1980s, it was no longer a competitive place for low-end manufacturing. So it moved up into electronics. And for the 80s and at least the early 90s, Singapore was known for its electronics. And those of you who will remember going to Singapore in the 80s and 90s will remember going to Mustafa to buy cheap electronics. But by the mid-90s or late 90s, it was already obvious that Singapore was not going to be very competitive in this field of electronics. And Singapore then repositioned itself as a financial hub. And through much of the 2000s, therefore, it emerged as Asia's leading financial hub. And more recently, it has again re-emerged as an entertainment and education hub. And many of you may be actually sending your kids there to study. Nobody in the 70s would have imagined that they would be sending their kids to study in Singapore, of all places. Now, this is a story of actually tinkering and readjustment. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his successors did not imagine in the beginning that what they were going to turn Singapore into. What they did is watched what was going on around the world and in their economy and continuously adjusted, rather like the dog that I mentioned in my story. Meanwhile, back in India, the bureaucrats who run Chandigarh are very, very proud that they have stuck to the original plan of the 1950s set out by Le Corbusier. Net result of it is that Chandigarh remains basically a subsidy scheme for civil servants. It is not a city at all. And so this point that I'm making is that real successful policy making is about flexibility and iteration and continuous feedback systems. Now, what does this mean in terms of how we make policy and reforms in a country like India, like Sri Lanka, and many other developing countries? Now, as many of you may be aware, that India has, in the last few weeks, introduced something called the GST. Now, it's one of the biggest tax reform efforts ever attempted in the world. In fact, it is certainly the biggest tax reform effort ever done in Indian history. And by virtue of this, basically, India will have a uniform tax system across the country. Till basically this was done, India didn't have a common market. It was actually easier for Mumbai to trade with London than it was to trade with Delhi, because there were all kinds of multiple tax systems inside the country that made it impossible for us to take advantage of our own internal market. And hopefully, with this reform, we will be able to do that. Now, this is not something that sort of is in innovation. Many people had argued about the importance of an internal market and of GST for a long time. What I'm going to really talk about is how it was actually implemented, which is quite different from what you would think. Now, the received wisdom would have been that the best way to go about this is to create a perfect design and implement it as meticulously as possible. The problem with a complex, evolving country like India, however, is that when you introduce such a massive reform, it is full of unintended consequences. It is full of complications and unknown directions that come about. So there were many people who would have argued that India was not really ready for introducing such a major reform, that we should have delayed it by maybe a year or two, put in place every single nut and bolt, and then have attempted something like this. But despite the fact that there were obviously many shortcomings and concerns, Prime Minister Modi and his team decided to go ahead and implement it on the 1st of July this year. It is not because they do not understand that there aren't complications in doing such a major reform. But you see, when you change to a new thinking process, the approach we took is the following, i.e., create what sounds like basically a reasonable system, introduce it, knowing fully well that it is not perfect, and then have a quick response team to try and fix it as we find the glitches in the system. This is a very different way of going about it than we would have done in the past. In the past, we would have created a 5-year plan, spent 20 years trying to actually plan that 5-year plan, and then try to have this perfect system, and then be entirely surprised by the fact that it didn't work. The approach we now do is put the system in place, and continuous feedback and research and quick response to continuously tinker it to make it work. We understand that it is not a perfect system. We will keep adjusting it till it works, and be always open to the point that in some future date, even if it works now, it may not work, and we may have to further tinker to do this. Now, this is a much more messy way of going about it. It certainly doesn't make for great academic papers, but in my view, this is the only way you can actually make policy in an environment where the economy is an evolving, complex system. And I'll give you another example of how this new way of thinking is beginning to influence the way we make policy. Now, the old way of thinking about business failure in India was that either there was some sort of a great moral failure on the part of the businessman, or that somehow, if only we manage to somehow tinker to try and cause a change in the way the company was managed, it would somehow recover. So we had something called the BIFR, which was the Board of Industrial Reconstruction. And the idea was it was about reconstruction. And that policy was used for many, many years. And the idea was basically that if only we managed to get the design right, we would finally manage to get these companies to do well. As a result of which, of course, we managed to keep alive black and white television companies alive for far longer than was absolutely necessary. The new way of thinking about it is that this is an evolving system. It is a system of creative destruction, of feedback. And what it means, therefore, is that we have to be much more prepared for creative destruction. So one of the most important reforms that we have done in the last couple of years is a bankruptcy code and a radically simplified bankruptcy system. The idea here is not to demonize our entrepreneurial class. Far from it. Our view is that an economy based on an entrepreneurial system must, in fact, be prepared for exit. That there'll be continuously new ideas, new entrepreneurship, new ventures, and some part of it will fail. A healthy system must allow these mutations to be continuously cleared out. And again, you can see that this is a conceptual shift to an idea not of intelligent design, but of continuous churn, of creative destruction. And in many ways, this fits with both the philosophical underpinnings of our shared civilization. You see, in both Hinduism and in Buddhism, the world is called Maya. Now, unfortunately, in English, this term Maya is mistranslated as meaning illusory. That's not what it means. The word Maya means impermanent or transient. The world is necessarily seen as transient. Because it is transient, it means, therefore, you need to continuously live in the present and adjust and adapt. So in the long run, this is what kept our civilization alive for thousands of years, because we as a civilization have continuously adapted. The Romans came and went. The British Empire came and went. We are still here. And this idea of continuous adaptation is very much there in Hindu philosophy and our mythology. One of our most sacred gods, most powerful gods, Shiva, is the god both of destruction and of innovation and creation and regeneration. This is not by chance. Because this is the idea that continuous tinkering, of adjustment, of continuous creative destruction. With that thought, let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanyal. I now hand over the session to Mr. Rajan Tyagaraja to continue with the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Shneur. Folks, I think we've had 4 commentaries which have been aptly complementing each other, a lot of content which has been shared. We probably have, while we have several questions which have been posed through the convention app, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative by just confining the questions to 2 due to the want of time. The first will be to Harsha, and then the next one will probably be to Sanjeev, and maybe commentary from the other panelists. Harsha, when we spoke about the old nature of exports and the fact that there is no point in exporting something which is not competitive, we also have something else which has been spoken a lot since November 2015 in the financial services sphere, the so-called Colombo International Financial Center. Given that we have 2 extremes in Dubai and Singapore, where those 2 nations have positioned those cities for the same purpose, is there a USP for CIFC in Sri Lanka? And is there something which you have to say in terms of the rollout in the next year or so?
Yesterday, we had a 2-hour discussion with the Prime Minister on this topic. We met with consultants who've been working with us for, I guess, almost a year over the weekend. And it's quite apt that you asked me this question today. There have been 106 or so attempts at creating financial cities around the world. And you can count on your fingers how many have succeeded. Countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, they are in totality financial centers. Then you have things like Dubai, DIFC, Qatar, FC, others, who are actually financial centers within countries. And the models are quite different. Now, I spoke about the hinterland. You know, who are we supposed to serve, right? The financial needs of India, southern India. Gujarat also has a financial center, but it's called Gujarat Financial Center. It's not an international financial center. Then we have Pakistan, Bangladesh. Don't forget, these are large countries and becoming middle-income countries, and the requirement for global financial transactions become much greater. So you can sort of visualize a market for a regional financial center in Colombo. However, is that sufficient for us to create this 600 acres of real estate into a bustling city that we want it to become? Iran talked about decisions made prior to us. We've inherited certain things, and what do we do with it? I'm not going to categorize it into whether it should have been done or not. But as policymakers, we must understand this is what we have. How do we make the best out of it? So I think that the financial component of the new 600 acres piece of real estate is going to be quite small. And in fact, the kind of things that we are unable to do right now because of the policy issues, the studying the Frisbee's angle has still not really sort of come back to us. We need to adapt with what's going on. And I completely agree with what Sanjeev said. So what is the emerging need? And will the banks, in the way in which banks operate today, will they operate in 10 years' time? Right? With cryptocurrency and blockchain and all of that in the horizon, and mobile phones becoming banks, and asset managers doing their job sitting in some building somewhere, and artificial intelligence becoming the driver. To what extent will a financial city be the need for this country or this region in the next 15, 20, 25 years? So I think we have understood that it is bigger than that. So I don't want to say exactly what we may call it, but it is certainly going to be more than a financial city. We want, was it Indrajit who was talking about foreigners investing in the stock market, foreigners coming in and buying bonds? What about the Sri Lankans? Big corporates with addresses in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Dubai, and in London. Can we create the culture, can we create the environment for them to set up and operate from the new entity? What are the kinds of policy changes that we need to do to ensure that happens? So now one of my responsibilities is to lead this effort. So under the Prime Minister, we're just setting up a new steering committee which I will chair, and then we will have different people. I want to set up working groups for tax, for real estate, for regulatory, for governance, for risk, and then hopefully we will understand what exactly the market demand is for to create the kind of entities that we want here beyond finance. Right? And just to end, there will be both regulated and non-regulated industries. For regulated industries, what will be the governance, the tax, the regulatory environment? For the non-regulated industries, what is it that we can offer? So all this, I think, will become clearer as we proceed. And if you ask for timeline, we have about 45% of the reclamation now complete. In about another year's time, we will be ready. I saw the project company people also in the audience, ready to start piling for the first buildings. The marina hopefully will be, coming online soon. So there's a whole lot of things, and with time, in the next weeks and months, we will make the business community aware of exactly where the opportunities lie. Thank you.
Thank you for that update, Harsha. Turning on to you, I think, Iran, in your commentary, you alluded to the fact that it's nervous to look at transformation without proper research and data. But I'd like to point out something with Sanjeev on what happened on November 8th of last year, when I think Prime Minister Modi shocked the nation by literally within a span of 2 hours made 86% of the currency in circulation non-legal tender. In terms of being one of his advisors, was there research and data going behind this particular shock doctrine? And after 8 months, do you see that having shaped the sort of transformation which was intended?
Sure. I, of course, joined after the thing was implemented, but nevertheless, I think you need to see this in the wider context of what Prime Minister Modi is attempting to do. This is, if you see it in isolation, then it's about bringing cash, black money out and narrowly trying to fix that. But in fact, what Prime Minister Modi is attempting to do is a much broader transformation of the culture of India. And this has to be seen in the context of now the GST, the much wider effort to bring the corruption levels down, the collusive linkages in the old elite, both political and business, and so on, and try and create a much more fluid, rule-oriented business culture in India. So I think that is the context in which you need to take this. This specific activity of the demonetization was just one peg in the wider arena. And I think it was a very, very important step in sort of jolting the system into a new path. I'll again use a Singaporean example just because we are on it anyway. If you go back to Singapore in the 1960s and 70s, Singapore was also a poor, crime-ridden, communally sensitive city. Now this is the context in which Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew at that time had introduced draconian municipal fines. You know, you can't spit, you can't chew gum, all kinds of things. Now why did he do it? Was it the case that he was trying to clean up the city, which he was of course trying to do? But the real intention was simply to impose a sense of order, a change of culture, a signaling that the old ways of doing things was no longer applicable. So this is the context in which you need to see Prime Minister Modi's demonetization. This was a clear signal that the old ways of doing things no longer apply. He had already, as you may be aware, significantly changed the culture of doing business in India. Its high-level corruption particularly has, I think everybody will agree that has come off very, very dramatically. But now what he was signaling to the wider population, that this is a change of trajectory. So quite apart from the very immediate business of bringing out hoarded black money in the system, it was a shock signal to the wider economy that, look, we have changed track.
Thank you. And just one final question. This is to do with inclusion. Again, I guess the government of India, as way back as 2009, established the Unique Identification Authority and created the Aadhaar system and the card. And in a sense, it really included the entire population in terms of access to medical care as well as basic access to finance. I know in our own Sri Lanka, we have, I believe, made some policy initiatives to do this about an announcement about 2 years ago. Perhaps this question is to maybe Iran. What are the challenges been in trying to get this 16-digit thing, or maybe Harsha, this 16-digit UID operationalized? Now it's been about 2 years since this announcement has been made.
Very quickly, I'll let you, I can tell you that it's on track. It's been stuck for, like you said, about 18 months because of some procurement issues. But all I can say is we did visit Aadhaar 2 weeks ago. We met with the CEO, Dr. Pandey. We had a long discussion, and we made some significant changes to how we need to look at the entire project. So that's all I can say at the moment. But I believe in the very near term, you will see how the restructured project will be announced, and hopefully very quickly we'll be able to have everyone connected. The Aadhaar already has got about 1.2 billion people enrolled and it is not that difficult to get 20 million enrolled. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsha. So that, I guess, brings this opening session to a conclusion. And while thanking all the panelists and the speakers for their time and effort, let me now hand this back to Chanel.